It's the USA Radio Daily. I'm your host, Gary Nolan. 6 minutes after the hour, coming up about an hour from now, Nina May is going to be with us. She is an author, political commentator, and a film producer. We'll chat with her, but first we kick the program off with Nathan Worcester from the Epoch Times. One major project bringing together a coalition to push for permitting reform in forest treatment, which is a major contributor to devastating wildfires. Nathan, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm great. Yes, nice to speak with you. And it is absolutely a significant issue, as I think anybody living in the western states can attest. You have hundreds of thousands of acres burning in Oregon and California, in Idaho, more than 6 million acres so far this fire season. And one of the huge issues is just the capacity for anybody to be able to clear out trees that would normally have been eradicated just through natural processes using mechanical thinning or controlled burns. So PERC is the name of the organization, Property and Environment Research Center. They are working together with some other groups to really provide a kind of broader legal basis for enabling management of forests in very common sense ways.
Well, it seems to me that before man got too terribly involved in it, you would have fires, but they were small. They weren't horribly large. And that would take up the kindling and whatever really flammable wood was left, and then it would sort of rebuild. But then we start coming in and we start extinguishing these fires. And I don't think we allow anybody to come in and pull the trees out that are dying or dead. And the next thing you know, we're loading up the floor of the forest with all kinds of kindling. And then when a fire starts, it gets so big you can't do anything about it. Am I on track on any of that?
You know, you absolutely are. It's a situation created in part by the what you might describe as misplaced priorities and policy. I think initially out of legitimate ignorance, but then increasingly out of an activist concern, I think, from parts of the environmental movement. Not all of the environmental movement, but people who are more radical. So, for example, you have groups that will do basically anything in their power in terms of litigation, in terms of pressuring individual lawmakers or agencies in order to ensure that forests are not cleared. Now, I want to give you an example that I think really illustrates how crazy the situation is. So right now, while it's very, very challenging to actually be able to clear out some of these forests and even use any of the wood for example, lumber. In our forests in the southeast, we are, if not clear cutting, then taking down massive amounts of wood, taking down many, many trees to be processed into wood chips that are used in Europe as biomass so that they can say that they are green, because their accounting only takes into account the actual processes that take place in their country. They don't take into account all of the damage that you could say occurs as a result of cutting down those trees in the U.S. So I just felt it's really worth understanding sometimes just how out of whack things are.
So importing wood doesn't count. Okay. We have more trees right now than we did 100 years ago growing in this country. So it's not like we're destroying fauna here. I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, there was this terrific fire out in California. And there were some firefighters that were willing to help. And I think one of them was even the U.S. Navy. But they didn't belong to the right union. Apparently, you have to join the right union in order for them to let you fight fires. And I think, well, gee, that's like going into a gunfight with one round in the gun. It's kind of limiting their ability to do what they want to do. Is that still the case now? Do you know?
You know, I can't speak to that directly. I can't speak to the union issues, but I will say I know that a perennial issue is the ability of firefighters at the level that we're talking about, being able to actually integrate and develop roots in the communities where they work. And that's actually part of the focus of a new bill that Senators Barrasso and Manchin have introduced. that basically aims to address a wide range of issues relating to forest management. One of them is to try to make sure that these firefighters are not, a separate class. But I think those barriers to entry that you mentioned, that's quite common when it comes to anything that I think involves the federal government.
Yeah, they screw up so much. Let me ask about NatCon. What is NatCon?
So this is the National Conservatism Conference. This year it was held in Greater Miami, Florida. It was, I guess you could say, a conclave of different conservative intellectuals, politicians, people like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, and others who are trying to basically debate the contours of a new vision of conservatism, one that is meant to, preserve the interests of particular countries, particular nations, against what you might call the onslaught of globalism. So that's globalism both in terms of the, economic effects of the loss of our industrial base, but also in terms of the push that you see for somewhat radical social policies, things like gender ideology being pushed across the world.
Yeah, that's crazy. Did you see what the Air Force was doing? I don't know if you saw the story or not. But
at this point, nothing would surprise me. But go ahead.
Isn't it a shame that we're at that point where? Because I agree with you. At this point, like nothing would surprise me. They're holding classes, and apparently they're telling their cadets diversity and inclusion training is important. You can't say mom or dad. You have to include all genders. Slide presentation called Diversity and Inclusion. What is it and why we care and what we can do? Some families are headed by single parents, grandparents, foster parents, 2 moms, 2 dads, etc. Consider parent or caregiver instead of mom and dad, the presentation says. Use words that include all gender. I guarantee you the Chinese are not doing this with their military, wasting their time worrying about transgenders and what to call them.
They're laughing at us.
Yes.
Honestly, they understand this as a weakness. They're not the ones who invented wokeness, but I think it's fair to say that countries that have an interest in the United States being weakened are probably quite delighted to watch us sabotage ourselves. The military, I think more than just about any other U.S. institution for, the better part of a century now, has been a means of bringing together people from many, many different backgrounds and treating them fairly within the context of a fighting machine, within the context of a singular mission. So this promotion of, in some cases, lowered standards, in other cases, this emphasis on a kind of obsession with one's ethnic victimization, what you could call ethno-narcissism, that is not just destructive in the ways that we're all familiar with, but I feel like it could be a death knell for our ability to fight, for our ability to defend our interests.
You have this vision of the military being a bunch of alpha males willing to rip into the opposition and fearing nothing. And now all of a sudden I got the feeling they're mixing in some beta males and they're kind of driving the alpha males out, and we're going to have a military that just doesn't have the testosterone to fight. I know that's a horrible thing to say, and I'm not apologizing for it because I'm not politically correct.
You shouldn't apologize. If you look at what's happened to our the testosterone levels of men in our country over the past few decades, we can debate the causes of it, but the notion that this is a good thing, the notion that masculinity is only ever toxic, is just one of the most destructive and self-destructive forces prevalent in our country, but also the West more broadly.
I'm going to protect my family. I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect my wife, to protect my family. And I think most men feel the same way. If that's toxic, well, that's life in the big city. Then I'm toxic. But this nonsense is just a bunch of Bravo Sierra. Populism, or populists versus libertarians. I'm curious about that. Tell me about that. That's part of this NatCon deal.
Yeah, and just to provide some context for this debate, there's a large contingent of people who are alumni of the Trump administration, especially younger staffers, who I think have come of age in the midst of all these cultural forces that we're talking about. I think many of them, they grew up reading the Austrians, reading Hayek and all that, and are certainly people who are inclined to oppose communism, for example, who are inclined to favor the free market. But then they've also seen an example I just cited was the deindustrialization of our country, which was, advocated often in the name of free markets. But, as we can see, the results have not been great for all of the country. The conflict really came into relief during a debate over the ESG movement, environmental, social, and governance. Some people advocate a return to a neutral market, a return to a situation where there is less politicization. And the counterpoint is basically it's really difficult for us to return to that point. So maybe it's necessary for the government to take proactive steps against ESG. And the example here is what Riley Moore in West Virginia and other officials in different states are doing to make sure that the pension funds and that the other assets under their control are not being invested through banks or through funds that have committed to opposition to fossil fuels or to other ESG principles. And they're starting to get results with this approach. So I think it's an important conflict to understand, but there's also a great deal of common ground in terms of the ultimate goals.
Well, I'm a recovering Republican. I worked with the Reagan campaign. I was a Republican for years. It was so long ago that I was actually part of a group called Young Republicans. Now I'm an old libertarian. But I think that the government, that what we do in this country is we keep Band-Aiding things. Nathan, we complain about the way the schools are not teaching civics and they're doing the 1619 project, and we're not actually recognizing the real problem, which is that government schools exist at all. There is a Department of Education federally. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives them that authority to create that. So what we're trying to do is fix a system that shouldn't exist.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the problem. We're never going to get it right.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of truth to that. There's an ongoing debate about the extent to which you can say that our Constitution was fundamentally reshaped by the expansion of executive power in various areas during the 20th century. First under FDR and then during the 1960s. And I think it's fair to say that there's a glimmer of hope in the resurgence of local action, of localism. And I would cite what the states are doing. So in many respects, they're taking advantage of what federalism already offers.
Nathan Worcester is our guest. I'm going to beseech him to hang on through this commercial break so we can come back and chat about ranchers. Are you able to do that, Nathan?
I am, yes.
All right, great. From the Epic Times on the USA Radio Daily. Hey, welcome. Glad to have you with us. Glad to be with you. 24 minutes after the hour. From the Epic Times, Nathan. And Nathan, would you please pronounce your last name? Because I clearly was abusing it.
Sure. You'll not be the last, I'm sure. It's Worcester.
Worcester. Did your parents explain that the R has a sound? Okay, I'll go with your parents. Worcester.
Like
Nathan,
the city in Massachusetts.
Yes, which is, well, never mind. Anyway, you and I were chatting about NatCon, libertarians and conservatives. And my point was just simply that what we tend to do in this country when we have a problem with a big government organization, whether it's public schools or anything else, is we try to fix the organization even though it has no reason to exist. There is no raison d'etre. We don't need government schools. There are all kinds of options that would be less expensive and more effective. And then we worry about, what are they teaching these kids? And, can we have prayer in the school? And these are arguments we don't even have to have. Christian nationalism, the current boogeyman of the left, another major theme, you're right, with speakers like Michael Knowles arguing that it defines the country's political order. What is Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question right now, isn't it? And I feel like even in a way, discussing it kind of plays into the hands of people who just want this to conjure up some sort of a terrifying image. But, to put it simply, if the backdrop of the founding of our country was Christianity, not an attempt to, mandate a particular sect within the country as a whole, but a shared set of moral values that were founded in Christianity, and the country conceived of itself as a nation, a distinctive country, a distinctive people, then yes, I think that's a fair description of the basic founding ethos of our country. But it's something that we've only become aware of as a lot of that religious backdrop has slipped away. That's why I think it's become this point of conflict, because the alternative, what you could call liberal democracy, if you look into how long the term has actually been around, it's not that old. It only emerged really in the 1980s. And yet we're constantly told not only is this the correct political order, the right way to describe America, but it has always been that way, and describing it as anything else is a threat to democracy.
Interesting. I've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to get to the ranchers. Ranchers
Sure.
in far northern California, southern Oregon are straining under aggressive water regulations enabled in part by the state's emergency powers during the current drought, which, by the way, is not the worst drought they've had on the West Coast, and it isn't even the longest drought they've had. I just thought I would point that out. As well as plans to eliminate a number of dams that have long sustained both human and non-human life in the region. So because of the state, it's destroying the ranches?
Yeah, that's what it seems to look like for the people there. I would just mention that I was able to visit a ranch, a very beautiful property that had been improved by the people who lived there. They had put in a number of ponds that clearly attracted and sustained a lot of other animals, everything from ducks and geese to foxes. And really, a lot of this comes down to your view of how humans relate to the land. Are humans capable of improving it? I think that was often how John Locke talked about human labor and the notion of us mixing labor into our property in order to make it ours and to give it value. Or are we simply a destructive force? Is the right course of action to do everything that is possible to eliminate the traces of humanity on the land? And in the case of Northern California, where Governor Gavin Newsom committed to the 30 by 30 plan to protect 30% of land and water by 2030, it certainly seems like there's this push in the direction of rewilding. So the broader context here is that not only are there these limitations on water that are going to be greatly scaled up through the demolition of the dams,